You are listening to the Airline Selection Podcast, where we bring you insights to help you succeed at airline selections. This podcast is brought to you by Airline Selection Program. Please welcome your host, airline captain and major airline recruiter, Guillaume Debauchez.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of our Airline Selection Podcast, which is designed to help you with your airline selections, but also gain valuable insights from our guests. And today we have Calvin Shields with us again in our Calvin Speaks series. Calvin, how are you doing today?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Guillaume. Thanks once again for inviting me on the show.
Great. So today we're going to talk about the Singapore Airlines incident that happened just a couple of days ago. We're actually going to record a different episode today, but because this has just arrived and Calvin told me that he had a close look at what happened, what we know, for now at least, we thought that we would discuss this fresh bit of news and bring you some insights and things that we can learn from it already. Calvin, over to you.
Okay, yeah, it's always worth remembering that we should learn, and it's important that we should learn from accidents and incidents, not just from the SIA, but from any accident or incident. We can always learn from the errors that were made, remembering, of course, that 80% of accidents are caused by human error because we are the weak link in the chain. In this particular event, it's an area of the world I know very well. It's the Bay of Bengal where the incident occurred. The aircraft was a 777-300 series flying at 37,000 feet. It actually occurred at about 2:30 local time in the afternoon, which is when the maximum heat is released by the Earth. So in other words, it's when thunderstorms are their greatest, their biggest, because that's at the mature stage. And effectively, the aircraft was flying at 37,000 feet and they ran into what they say was clear air turbulence. Well, people say, well, how can you have clear air turbulence and you're not in a thunderstorm? Well, actually you can, because there can be quite severe turbulence around the edges of a thunderstorm. And the weather radar plot map that I've seen shows that it was actually just to the edge of a large thunderstorm. Well, we in the industry, or the required separation from a cloud is 20 nautical miles. He was quite a lot closer than that. I believe that he went into some clear air turbulence, which was caused by the thunderstorm, but it wasn't actually in the thunderstorms. Now, the ASP'S data, which has been released, shows that he had height deviations of plus, I beg your pardon, 100 feet and minus 300 feet. Effectively, a height deviations of 400 feet. And in my experience, that is extremely severe turbulence, because I can honestly say that in nearly 50 years of flying, I rarely, in clear air turbulence, rarely exceeded more than 50 feet in altitude because of the turbulence. It's also worth remembering that we don't know yet, of course, what actually happened. But of course, it's a legal requirement for Singapore Airlines, along with Boeing, and if the engines were Rolls-Royce, along with the UK authorities, to release a preliminary report within 30 days. And I would suggest that it's probably not a good idea to point the finger until we've seen the preliminary report. But it's also worth remembering that in thunderstorms of that sort of magnitude, it is very possible to have downdrafts in the center of a thunderstorm of near enough 10,000 feet a minute, which equates to roughly 100 miles per hour vertical. So if you happen to fly in a downdraft of that magnitude, you're going to encounter severe wind shear and turbulence. I'm not suggesting he was in the thunderstorm. My honest thoughts are that he wasn't, but we will find out in probably about 30 days. What the ADS-B actually shows is that he didn't start the descent from 37,000 feet to 31,000 feet until maybe 15 minutes after the actual turbulence event. Of course, what the press, in their hysterical way, have done is they said the aeroplane plunged 6,000 feet. That's completely untrue. It actually gained and lost a total of 400 feet. And it was a controlled descent, in my view, to either get away from the turbulence or to get to a lower level where the aeroplane is more controllable at a lower level. So I will wait and see until we know for sure. But my opinion is they actually didn't fly in a thunderstorm.
Very well, Calvin. Yeah, thank you so much about that. And yeah, we all know that thunderstorms are dangerous. We are very careful not to take off in a thunderstorm. Actually, all of this will be explained in your flying manual, in your flight crew training manual, or flight crew techniques manual in an Airbus. They will tell you how far you should stay away. Like you said, when you're in altitude, it's 20 miles. When you're taking off, you should steer clear of any turbulence of more than 3 miles, but you have to take into account also your runoff to take off. And so basically, if there's anything that plots within 7 miles from the point where you are, you should basically not take off. Okay, all of this is explained in your flight crew training manual, and we know how close we're allowed to go. Now, it all depends as well, because sometimes when we're at cruise altitude and if we are upwind, then it's fine to fly a little bit closer because, of course, the wind blows the turbulence towards us. So if we're on the good side of the cloud, so to say, we can fly a little bit closer in complete safety. But yeah, what happened there is sad. I mean, looking at the state of the aircraft inside, it's in very, very bad condition. It might be worth to explain, on top of the regulations that I've just explained, the SOPs around the distances you should take into account during takeoff, at lower altitude, and then at higher altitudes. The SOPs that happen between the crew when turbulence is expected. So there's kind of a gradual process. So first of all, you could anticipate this turbulence because this turbulence was forecast, maybe even from the time of your departure. Maybe you know that this is an area where clear air turbulence was reported. You would actually mention it to the crew already at briefing state. And so they would know, which would help them arrange their service. If you have an 8-hour flight and during 2 hours there is turbulence forecast, then maybe they want to do their service away from these zones, of course, because the main problem for them is to be standing with carts in the middle of the alleys and passengers, moving a lot when the turbulence happens. So you will, at briefing already, you can prevent some of the risk. Then afterwards, when you're airborne, if an airplane in front reports turbulence, then you're going to be able to, usually they will say when it happened at a waypoint or something, and then you'll be able to convey that to your crew, right? And then you'll tell them, hey, it's reported there. I need you to have stowed the carts by then and to be sat down, for instance. And then, of course, you'll make a PA to the passengers. Now, the further case where actually it starts to get bumpy and it's not looking good that it's going to abate, and now you need to sit them down immediately, that you'll make a PA and they will sit down and they'll basically press the red pedal on their cart so the cart stays where it is, and they will sit down on the first available seat, which is sometimes a passenger seat. Sometimes they can reach their jump seat, sometimes not. We want to protect our passengers. We want to protect our crew as well. And so now they are sat down in turbulence that could get severe with a cart that is just secured laterally, but not vertically. If severe turbulence happens, the cart could be jumping up and down, fall on someone's leg. And this is something that's happened quite a lot, unfortunately. And these things have really bad edges and it can really hurt someone. So like you said, we learn from this, but this is actually how SOPs have been designed to, if you stick to your SOP, you're likely to be able to prevent a lot of these incidents from happening. Would you agree, Calvin?
I agree completely with what you've said, Guillaume. I certainly, on one occasion when I first started on the 747 in 1975, I was 25 years old, very new co-pilot, and I was the co-pilot to a very aggressive ex-wartime captain. I will talk about these sort of characters in a later episode. But basically, during the war, the captains were one-man bands. They only had a single pilot in the RAF. There was no second pilot. They're not used to flying as a crew. They were individuals. And on this particular aeroplane, the old 100 series 747, the radar was very basic. It had no colors. And it was just before the monsoon was about to break. And there was one huge, humongous thunderstorm, I reckon in the whole of India, effectively, which was on our track as we were taking off out of Calcutta. Now, we took off with the radar in standby, and the idea was that it was warmed up, ready to be switched on. And we turned towards the thunderstorm, which was on our track. And the captain, instead of asking me to turn the radar on, he switched it off. And the problem now was that the radar took, I can't remember, 45 seconds to warm up. And effectively, we flew straight into the thunderstorm. And this occurred, as I say, right at the beginning of my career. And believe me, I will never, ever go near a thunderstorm ever again in my life. We were in the middle of an updraft we had a nose pitch down attitude. It's about 6 degrees or maybe more. And we were going up at 6,000 feet a minute. The turbulence was so great that I could not see the instruments. They were bouncing around, which of course is the definition of severe turbulence anyway. The flight engineer called pressurization failure because the automatic pressurization couldn't keep up with the change of altitude. And it was absolutely horrific. And we've been hit by hail, which makes a huge amount of noise. And we were struck by lightning. And we popped out of the side of this thunderstorm after probably only 30 seconds, and it felt like a lifetime. And I learned lots of lessons there, and one of which, most importantly, never to go anywhere near a thunderstorm. The second is how very, very powerful these meteorological phenomena are, and also the importance of considering seatbelts well in advance of being anywhere near a thunderstorm. And of course, in tropical areas, thunderstorms are always a feature. They're very rarely a day when you don't encounter thunderstorms. And so you spend a lot of your life picking your way between thunderstorms. I'd had my nose glued literally to my radar for 6 or 7 hours, which is very tiring. And you mentioned one thing which I didn't mention, very important. You try to go upwind if you can of a thunderstorm because, as you rightly say, the turbulence will be blown downwind. And so, yeah, the seatbelt signs, for example, are very important that we put them on. I would certainly, in any area of thunderstorm activity, warn the cabin crew, put the seatbelt signs on and so on. But what we also need to consider is that the passengers have paid a lot of money for a comfortable flight. So the balance between being seated the whole time, because you have the seatbelt sign on, which is the safest option, and allowing them to walk around willy-nilly, as we say in English, is a difficult one to make. And I think it falls very much on the shoulders of the crew to get a happy medium between the two. And that comes with experience and that comes with training.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for passengers to be sad, and the main thing for passengers, okay, some of them want to stretch their legs, but for the most, passengers have been waiting in the terminal. Maybe they had a drink in the terminal and then they arrive in the waiting room and now they are waiting for quite a while. And by the time you depart and can finally release them, it could be 45 minutes, an hour. For a lot of people, this will be uncomfortable because they just need to go to the bathroom. To me, that's my personal view, is that we owe it to them to be able to release them as soon as possible when the SOP allows, which would be typically at 10,000 feet, or to let them know, on the ground, if it's going to be bumpy, that they should go to the bathroom now, or things like that, so that they have this comfortable flight. Not just the turbulence, but also, not have a problem that becomes painful to them, really. And, well, I would remove the seatbelt sign at 10,000 feet. It was stable. And if it's bumpy again at 20,000 feet, then we're not talking severe turbulence here. We're talking about that it could be a bit jittery later on. Then we put it back on, But I think it's part of our job as pilots to look after that and not be lazy and just leave the seatbelt signs on just in case. If there's a cloud, if there's a thunderstorm, if there's forecast, if someone reported it, yes. Otherwise, we don't have to wait until we're in the cruise to let people wonder about the plane, right?
I agree completely, Guillaume. I think that we know that SOPs are basically our framework to operate the aeroplane, which is developed and it keeps changing over time as incidents or designs of the aircraft change. But as we also know, it is quite acceptable for the commander of the aeroplane to go outside the SOPs if it's regarded the safest option. And in some cultures, that is quite difficult because I would guess in cultures who respect rules and regulations perhaps a bit more than the French and the English do, it's difficult and very uncomfortable then to consider going outside SOPs. It also depends on what sort of airline you're flying for. Is it a closed culture? Is it a punitive culture where they feel that if they don't follow the SOPs, they'll get in trouble? That's another really big issue as well, is trying to overcome these perceived problems or threats to their job, I suppose.
Yes, indeed. As far as I'm concerned, for the turbulence, the SOP is actually quite well designed in the sense of these SOPs were maybe not well designed many years ago because they were not as well explained. But now, at least at the airline I was at last, it was very well explained. You're not allowed to get closer from this type of cloud within this distance. And then, like I explained before, it takes you 4 miles to go down the runway, take off. After that, 3 miles, that's 7 miles. Below 20,000 feet, it's 10 miles. And then above 20,000 feet, it's 20 miles. And it was very clear. And then depending on what happened, you took specific actions like I explained before. So all this was very clear. And it's about also your leadership as a captain, also to make sure that your crew understand from the briefing stage what you expect. When we tell them to sit down now, it's not stow the carts and go and sit down. It's sit down now. Your leadership, it has a very big importance at this point, that they understand that SOPs have to be followed particularly when it's important. I'm sure you agree with that, Calvin. That your
Yes.
expectation level is important so that they actually do what is intended.
Yes, I agree completely, Guillaume. For me, in British Airways particularly, we would have pilot briefing, the cabin crew would have their own briefing, and then we would come together where I would brief the whole crew. And it was really important right from the word go to establish a rapport between the flight deck and the cabin crew, such that when you gave them an order, they know you weren't messing around and that you meant
Exactly.
it, and they would respect your orders. So that's really important.
Exactly.
But it's up to us as crew to engender a good relationship with the cabin crew rather than a distant one. Unfortunately, in some airlines, there's very little, if you like, communication or cooperation between the flight deck and the cabin crew. But it's important that it should be there.
Yeah, exactly. And what I found when I became a captain is that, I'm really at work to work, and I need the team to do their work. And so the thing is, you do it you can be friendly, but if you blur that boundary between being friendly and your expectation level, where that boundary becomes so unclear that people think that the SOP is not so important. So I found that actually you can't be friends with anyone. I'm not coming to work to make friends. I'm coming to work well and to have a friendly attitude and to be pleasant. But there's this sort of the gradient still has to exist, even though you want it to be as shallow as possible so that communication continues to flow. It needs to be there. The co-pilot needs to understand it. You need to set it in the right way so they still can talk to you and feel free to do so. And with the crew, it's a similar dynamic in a way. So that they don't start to do things in the cabin that they don't tell you about, for instance. You need to know things.
Also, if we extend that, we talk about the authority gradient on the flight deck, which I'm sure most people would understand the captain has the ultimate say, and therefore there should be more authority, if you like, in the left-hand seat compared with the co-pilot in the right-hand seat. But in some cultures, this actual gradient can be almost vertical. For example, when I was with Singapore Airlines, for example, I was older, and people of age command respect just automatically, culturally in Singapore. I was extremely well experienced on the aeroplane, and that increased the authority gradient. I was also an examiner, which increased it even further. And then on top of that, I was management as well. So a lot of the co-pilots found it very difficult. The local co-pilots found it very difficult to say anything to me at all, let alone, criticize me. And it was very difficult. I spent 3 years in training management in Singapore Airlines, trying to reduce this authority gradient. And I think I succeeded quite well. But then when I left, I believe it went back to where it was before. But that's not just Singapore, of course. There are cultures throughout the world that have very similar values. And I would suggest most of those are in the Far East.
It's true. The airplanes were designed according to Occidental culture, so to say. Typically in Europe and in the US, in Europe for Airbus and in the US for Boeing, if you want to summarize it. The whole concept of CRM, which, human factors we discussed, was probably the most important subject of the whole ATPS course, is designed around this flow of communication. And when the culture gets in the way, it's a big problem. And even for you as an examiner, someone who they would struggle to speak back to, the thing is, I'm sure you will agree that you are not fallible. So you could make a mistake. You could get tired. You could forget something. your co-pilot couldn't help you because they don't dare. Well, it's a big safety issue actually for you too, right? So I think that's probably
Sorry,
why you endeavored to get them to speak as much as possible and make them comfortable that
absolutely.
they
And,
could.
and I must honestly say, I really tried very hard. Before I was even a trainer or an examiner, there was still this very steep authority gradient. And I would try very hard to say to them, look, I would say things like, I'm getting on a bit here. I'm getting a bit older. I'm relying on you to be my ears, my eyes. I can't see very well anymore. I can't hear very well, and so on. And I would say that to them try to say hello to them, if you like. And they would say, "Oh, say you can't say that." They wouldn't accept my sort of sense of humor in that respect. So it became very difficult. I would suggest in Western cultures, it's much easier to follow that line of discussion than it is. I couldn't make fun of myself, put it that way. And that was very, very noticeable to me.
Excellent. So today we talked about this incident. We talked about turbulence, the consequences, and we said that in this field, SOPs are quite good and following them will likely protect you. We also said that it was not always the case. You hinted on that, Calvin, and I think we need to remind ourselves that the SOP number one is the captain is supposed to take a safe course of action at all times, even if it means deviating from any regulation or standard operating procedure, meaning that the captain, its ultimate SOP is safety. So if you have a procedure that will not be safe, it is better for you to do something else, which is why actually flexibility and creativity is one competency that will be checked during your recruitment at most major airlines, because they want to make sure that you're not going to endanger the airplane for the sake of an SOP. And if you're very junior here, you're probably wondering what we are on about. And Calvin, I thought that we would talk about an example that is very sad and that most of us remember, which is the SR 111, and how following an SOP actually led to a serious loss of life and how it could maybe have been avoided. You want to talk about that?
Yes, in a nutshell, it was a Swiss Air. I believe it was a DC-10, maybe, I can't remember, but it was a large aeroplane, and they had a fire in the cockpit, if I remember correctly, and they were flying to, I guess, Geneva from New York or somewhere like that, and they were pretty close to Halifax I think it's Nova Scotia, isn't it? And they were dealing with the fire, and it became obvious that the fire was getting out of control. And the safest course definitely would have been to do a straight-in approach and land overweight in Halifax or wherever it was. But what the captain decided to do, he was actually a training captain, he wanted to dump fuel down to landing weight. And so they went round in the hold whilst the aeroplane was getting... the fire was in the cockpit, I believe, because I seem to remember a reporter, the co-pilot, was being covered with molten plastic on the CVR. They discovered that it was actually burning in the flight deck. And of course, in the end, the aircraft crashed, which was absolutely horrific, really, because the captain insisted on following SOPs. One thing to remember about fires, and this is a subject that is really close to my heart. My biggest fear in the whole of my career was a fire in the cabin. And statistically, aircraft that have crashed because of fire on the aircraft that have ended up with fatalities, statistically, the time between the fire being discovered and the aircraft crashing is 14 minutes. And that's a statistic that comes from 20 or 30 different incidents historically. So you've got 14 minutes to get on the ground. If you're at 37,000 feet and you're coming down at 2,000 feet a minute, you're going to die before you hit the sea. So that's another subject we could perhaps talk about. But yes, SOPs are definitely you're covered by the law, by air law, to be able to work outside the SOPs if the captain regards that as the safest option.
Yes, indeed. And in this case, just to make it a bit even more clear, in their SOP, it said that under no circumstance should you land above max landing weight. So he didn't want to break that SOP, and as a result, they ended up exiting the flight deck actually because it was on fire, and we know what happened next. Nobody knows whether they would have managed to land within the 14 minutes, but they didn't make an attempt, which is really quite sad. So this teaches us a lesson, which actually was one of the topics we wanted to discuss today, lessons that we can learn. This is a very big lesson, and you have to be open to the idea. I mean, what is an SOP? An SOP is a way for us to work together in an easy way. So if we didn't have SOPs, it would take us 2.5 hours to get the airplane away, every time, because we'd have to reinvent everything. So these SOPs help us work together quickly. It's a form of art. It's something that we enjoy doing well after we master it. It's something that actually, it's a constraint, but it actually gives us a lot of freedom to then do things quicker. But the SOP is what? Initially, the airplane is designed, and they design an SOP based on their expectation of what is likely to happen. Then gradually there are incident reports. Things happen, and then when things happen, the SOPs get modified. As an airline pilot, you will see in your career, you're going to have to be very open to change because things change a lot. If you open an Airbus manual from now and one from 1995, although it's on the same plane, it doesn't quite look the same. There's only similarities, really. So you have to be open to the fact that something will happen on your flight, and your flight will be the first one that will have something that happens where the SOP doesn't work. The SOP has been thought in a certain circumstance, but you're having a different set of circumstances today. Orographic circumstances, terrain circumstances, human circumstances, whatever it is, this SOP is not working. You need to do something else. And so that's what the airlines are looking for. They're looking for pilots who are, I often say this in our trainings, smart yet manageable, who will comply, but at the same time, who will, if needed, save the day by thinking in a different way, using their airmanship typically is their experience that they have and all the experience they've gathered from their colleagues, to try and find the best possible solution. So yeah, would you have anything to add, Calvin, to?
Yes, I would, Guillaume. You said it absolutely the way that I would describe it. But of course, as ever, it's the experience that is perhaps most important later on in a career like mine that spanned, near enough 50 years, not far off it. I saw so many things. I learned so many things that I really feel now that I have to pass on those experiences to the next generation. You can learn the books, but until you've actually experienced something, you don't understand it completely.
Exactly. I agree. One thing I'll say as well, this is something that we have in advanced course and in our courses, is when it comes to SOPs, there's really also two areas. There's the areas before you've departed and the area after you've departed. Before you've departed, you don't have to depart. After you've departed, you have this concept of this linked destiny. We have a linked destiny in this metal tube that's flying across the air. So before departure, there are so many moving parts to dispatching an airplane, and the bigger the plane, the more moving parts, that sometimes you have to adjust the SOP. And this is actually acceptable and intended. It's actually one of the biggest areas of initial line training, is to explain that the book says you have to do things in this order, but actually you have to adjust to the fact that your fuel truck doesn't come as planned, that your fuel weight doesn't arrive as expected, there's a crew who's late, the passengers are stuck at the gate. All of this means that you have to adjust your working blocks and the SOP, then you catch the SOP with checklists and with your experience. So that's an area where basically almost every flight's a bit different to the SOP. Once you're airborne, now it's different. Now we're in the scenario that we just described, where if the checklist doesn't work, if the SOP doesn't work, now you need to think of safety, because now you're airborne and consequences could be severe. I hope this makes sense to you as well, Calvin. I welcome your opinion.
Yes, absolutely, Guillaume. SOPs are the cornerstone of the operation. One thing you did mention, of course, if you fly for a very large airline, you may never fly, or you may fly with the same co-pilot every 2 or 3 years. It's quite often every trip that you do, the trips that you do is with a new co-pilot, let's say, for me as a captain. And you get to be able to get the aeroplane on its way because he knows, what he should do because it's prescribed by the SOPs. We do the same thing. That means that we don't have any delays. We get the aeroplane turned around in 1 hour because he's expected to follow a sequence of events, the SOPs, and so are you. The other thing too is if I started to, as a captain, vary the SOPs or diverge from the SOPs, that is also a good indicator to suggest maybe I might be becoming incapacitated, so that it can actually have a secondary, if you like, safety effect, is to, if you don't follow the SOPs, it might indicate there's a problem somewhere.
Yeah, it could be either that you don't care or that you are committing a violation, typically not complying for personal gain, typically getting home quicker, or just doing something because there's another agenda in your life that's taking a preoccupation, or indeed it can get to the point of an incapacitation, something that younger candidates don't really understand. They don't understand that they may have to actually come all the way to a takeover from a captain who's doing this. And it's kind of tough if you're in your first 6 months. How can you expect to know where the boundary is? But that's the whole point of you gaining experience, is to know when. A little hint is, to me, is if you can most of the time feel it already from briefing. If someone's a bit off.
Yes, no, I think I agree with you. This is I would suggest a new co-pilot joining an airline, the most difficult decision they would ever have to make is to try and decide whether or not a captain is incapacitated for various reasons. If it's a subtle incapacitation where he hasn't sort of collapsed in his seat, obviously incapacitated. If he's just diverging or diverting from the SOPs because he wants to fly over his mother's house, or is he having a mental problem? It's really, really difficult. But of course, the easiest way to deal with this would be for the co-pilot to say, "Captain, you're not following SOPs. Is everything okay? Can you explain to me why?" But a very, very, very difficult decision for any very young co-pilot to do. And it's a decision I wouldn't want to have made myself.
Yeah, so you can see how human factors are so important. I hope that this episode gave you some perspective. I think we're going to close it now, Calvin. We've got some more episodes to do where we'll bring you more insights. And of course, I would like to thank you again, Calvin, for giving your time and coming here. And of course, if you want to gain even more insights, you know that we are here with the Airline Selection Program to help you succeed at your airline selections. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you soon in the next one.
This podcast was brought to you by Airline Selection Program, a company that is focused on helping you succeed at airline selections. Our flagship course, Advanced Interview Course, has helped hundreds of pilots just like you become successful. Visit our website at online.airlineselectionprogram.com and find out how you too can get the job of your dreams.